Hello, everybody. Welcome to our live show. I hope you're having a great weekend. You can invite a friend or take a friend for us to learn together. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your support. Today, I just wanted to share briefly some different types of education, and there's spiritual, there's personal, academic, professional, and financial. And sometimes we wonder why we're not successful in life. But for us to be successful, we need all the types of education. You can, if you succeed academically, but you're not financially intelligent, you find you may be surpassed by someone who may not be as equally educated, but they have financial intelligence and they've pursued financial education, and they do well in life. So we need to be in a position where we are an all-rounder, spiritually, academically, personally, professionally, and financially, for us to be successful. On one of our shows, Themba taught us that to be financially free, we need financial intelligence, financial plan, into financial discipline. And all those things, we get them as we develop our financial education, as we pursue our financial education. Sometimes it's one area that we take for granted. No one is really born financially intelligent or financially educated. We have to pursue it so that we know how to make money, manage money, and multiply money. Robert Kiyosaki says financial freedom is a mental, emotional, and educational process. Any news that you wish to bring to our attention, to the attention of our viewers, Themba?
Yes, as usual, there are things that I would want to say before we talk about the topic today. The first thing that I would want to say, Tafazo, you would know that in this week, there was an inauguration ceremony for the president in South Africa. I think it happened on Tuesday this week. But what caught my attention was the response of the market soon after the inauguration and the performance of the markets afterwards. So what we saw was a situation where the rand went below 18 to the US dollar after a very, very long time. And before I came on to this show, I actually had a look at the performance of the rand. It's still trading below the 18 rands to the dollar mark. So, and the reason for that is the markets were actually encouraged that after his inauguration, we're going to have business-friendly policies, especially after the coalition with the DA. The JSE All Share Market Index also responded quite positively. Soon after the inauguration, I think we saw the market going above the 18,000 mark, which it hasn't done for a very long time. Now, I think it was trading just under 80,000. So since then, the performance has gone down. A similar reaction was noted on the bond market as well. In fact, of the bond issuance that happened soon after, I think one of the bond issuance was 6 times subscribed. Why am I mentioning all this? I'm mentioning this to drive a key point, especially with regard to investments. Prior to the conclusion of the coalition arrangements, I think we were talking about political uncertainty. And we were also, at the beginning of the year, we were also talking about political uncertainty, especially as a result of the extraordinary number of elections that will be happening globally this year. But there is an important lesson to be learned, especially for investment purposes. And this is the lesson. Normally, stock markets do not respond to political uncertainty and economic uncertainty. What tends to happen in most cases is that because of political and economic uncertainty, some investors tend to panic. And because they panic in the process of selling their investment as a result of the panic, they end up losing quite a lot of money. But if you look at history, the history of elections, whether it's in America or it's in South Africa, because when we do investments, we do quite a lot of research and we go back into history. Because in most cases, what happened historically could be an indicator of what may happen in the future. So when we study history, the history of elections in America and in South Africa as well, it's quite clear that the stock market soon after the election has actually gone up. And that's something that we must be mindful of at all times and not really panic. So that's one of the things that I just want to highlight. Don't change your investment strategy. Don't panic as a result of political uncertainty. If you are to make financial progress in life, particularly as far as investment is concerned, you need to be in there for the long haul. You need to have a long-term strategy. Elections will come and go, but markets will also be there. And in most cases, there is no direct correlation between political uncertainty and the performance of markets. What was very interesting to me, Tafadzwa, around the market reaction is that in a very long time, if you analyze the markets in South Africa, normally markets respond to good news that comes from global happenings. Most of what influences the JSE is as a result of global happenings. So what we saw on Tuesday was a good news story happening in South Africa, influencing the market. And I hope that it's going to be good news for South Africa going forward. But regardless of the fact of whether it will be good news or bad news, as an investor, you need to have a long-term strategy. Don't change your strategy as a result of economic or political uncertainty. So that's the first thing that I want to highlight. The second thing that I want to highlight is what the banks have been saying, particularly with regard to debt cancelling arrangement. Tafadzo, you would know that in the past year, interest rates have been rising, and in the year before that, and a number of consumers have been impacted on their finances as a result of the rising interest rates. And quite a number of consumers have actually applied for debt cancelling arrangement. If you are listening to us outside of South Africa, a debt cancelling arrangement is where you officially register yourself in terms of the National Credit Act for debt cancelling. You're basically saying, I'm overly indebted, I can't keep up paying my debts, so I need protection from creditors. And so you go under a legal arrangement. But what banks have noted is number one, there's been an increase of debt cancelling arrangement. That comes as a no surprise because the interest rates are very high. But also the opinion from some banks, in fact, the major banks in South Africa, is that consumers are entering prematurely into this debt cancelling arrangement. In other words, we've seen a group of professionals marketing themselves as debt counselors, and sometimes they would want us to go into this arrangement, not necessarily in the interest of the consumer, but in their interest because they would want to collect fees from the debt cancelling arrangement. So the one thing that we're saying there, based on what the banks are saying, there are two things that we're saying. The first thing that we're saying is before you consider going for a debt cancelling arrangement, talk to your bank. I think banks, because of the increase in indebtedness among the consumers, they are much more prepared to give you waivers in terms of both interest and capital payments. So talk to your banker first, talk to your bank first before entering into a debt cancelling arrangement, because some of these arrangements are not always in the interest of the consumer. Secondly, just consider the benefits and the downside of entering into such an arrangement. One of the things that we need to bear in mind is that once you enter into a debt cancelling arrangement, there is a huge impact on your credit score. So your credit score is hugely impacted, and you won't be able to have access to finance in a very, very long time. In fact, I was actually considering a case of somebody who went into a debt cancelling arrangement for a year. After they had gone into such an arrangement, there wasn't a significant improvement in their overall indebtedness, but they had paid something like 9,000 in fees. And that's potentially what can happen. So I'm not necessarily discouraging anyone for filing for debt cancelling. I'm just saying, get advice, get professional advice. It must be a considered discussion with your financial advisor after, obviously, you've spoken to your bank. But let's also not forget that the debt cancelling arrangement is a very important mechanism to protect your assets. The third thing that I would want to say, again, this comes from some of the comments that I have seen concerning what is currently happening, and it's around the prescription law. Let me ask you something, Tafadzwa. Tafadzwa, are you aware of the prescription law, the debt prescription law in South Africa? I'm just asking you on the spot. I know we didn't discuss this before, but are you aware of the debt prescription law in South Africa?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I'm sure
Yes,
you
yes.
can. Yeah.
After this discussion, you'll be aware. Most consumers are not aware of the Debt Prescription Act. The Debt Prescription Act basically says, Tafadzwa, if you borrow money from anybody and they forget about that debt, in other words, they don't ask you about that debt for 3 years, then that debt prescribes. Um, a prescribed debt is basically an old obligation that the consumer has not acknowledged, in terms of indebtedness, and they have not paid within a 3-year period. When we say that debt prescribed, we basically mean that the creditor has no right legally to claim that money from you. So let me explain it easily so that you understand, Tafadzo. If you get money from the bank, for example, and let's just look at a scenario where the bank does not contact you after you getting that money, and within 3 years, you do not contact the bank, you do not acknowledge that you owe the bank. After a 3-year period is passed, the bank has no right to collect that debt from you. The debt is prescribed. In other words, it's written off. There is no legal obligation for the debt to be paid by you as a debtor. Why am I talking about the Debt Prescription Act? There have been unscrupulous creditors and unscrupulous banks that have continued to collect prescribed debt from consumers because the consumers are not aware of this debt prescription law. In other words, they are not aware that debt prescribes. Obviously, normally what happens here is that a debt collector will phone you, and one of the things that they will do when they phone you is, do you acknowledge that you owe the creditor this amount of money? Once you say yes, it interrupts the prescription. So what we are seeing more and more is clever debt collectors who would want the consumers to acknowledge the debt so that the debt does not prescribe, right? And also, once you commit to pay, then there is an interruption in the prescription. So here are my 2 tips to consumers, particularly those consumers that are overly indebted. I know all of us, if we are overly indebted, we feel a moral obligation to pay our debts. But let's just understand here. we are aiming for debt freedom. Whatever loophole we can exploit legally, we would want to exploit legally. So, as somebody who is overly indebted, don't have this moral obligation, particularly to financial institutions, to pay off your debt. If the debt is prescribed, there is no obligation, there is no legal obligation. So let's distinguish your moral obligation to pay debts and your legal obligation to pay debts. Once the debt is prescribed, there is no legal obligation. The second thing that I would want to give as a tip to everyone who is overly indebted is that be very careful when you converse with the debt collectors, particularly debt collectors collecting on behalf of banks. I don't like telephone conversations. Stay away from telephone conversations. Don't commit anything on the phone. Just ask the person to put it in writing. So they will ask you questions such as, do you acknowledge that you owe the financial institution this amount of money? Would you want to make an arrangement? Just say to them, can you put it in writing? Because some of these debt collectors will phone you at very odd hours. In fact, they know that the most likely time that you're going to take the call is early in the morning before you start your work. So they will phone you early in the morning when you're going to work. And part of what they would want to do is to get you to a point where you interrupt the prescription. And sometimes they will phone you after work when you are at home, because that's also a likely time to reach all those people that owe money. So my tip to you is that, particularly for those long outstanding debts, because I'm not speaking to somebody who is not overly indebted. I'm talking to somebody who is overly indebted and you owe the world quite a lot of money. If you are in that situation, there is hope for you. There is hope for you. Don't be guided by a moral obligation to pay the debt. I'm talking about debt to the financial institution. Obviously, if you're owing a friend money, you've got a moral obligation to pay off that amount. I'm talking about borrowings from banks and borrowings from companies. We have to pay because there is a legal obligation to pay. So just be aware of this prescription and ask all your creditors to put things in writing. So that's the other thing that I would want to say. Let me go to global news, Tafazo. There are two things that I would want to say which caught my attention. I think 2 days ago, there was a newspaper report of I think it's the wealthiest family in the UK. They are an Indian family called the Hinduja family. They've got, I think they stay in Switzerland. By the way, most billionaires who have made money will stay in Switzerland. I'll tell you one day, Tafadzo, why people prefer to do that. But the Swiss financial system is perceived to be the safest financial system in the world. But that's besides the point for now. Um, so what this Induja family would do is that they would take domestic staff from India because they're originally from India. In fact, I think they own one of the prestigious hotels in the UK, the Raffles Hotel. I think it's the Raffles Hotel. Very, very prestigious hotel. So they didn't treat their domestic staff very, very well. In fact, they would really abuse them. That's what the allegation, was actually saying. To such an extent that during the court proceeding, I think there was a statement to the effect that this family was spending far more on their dog than on the domestic staff. Why am I mentioning this? I'm just mentioning this as part of the ethics that we must have, particularly on our journey to financial independence. Don't abuse people. Sometimes I come across people that are making money that abuse their workers, that abuse the people that work in their homes. It's not a good thing to do. It's not, don't get to a situation where money causes you to not look at your workers as people deserving of dignity or a dignified treatment. So I normally do not speak well of people that are wealthy, but who abuse or mistreat other people. I think to me that's a no, no, no. As far as the ethics of handling money is concerned, you don't have to be nasty. You don't have to abuse or mistreat other people. So the end result, Tafazo, was that I think 4 members of the Induja family were jailed between 4 to 4.5 years. We're talking about billionaires here. Obviously, they're going to appeal the sentence, and it would be interesting to me what happens during the appeal of that sentence. But to me, the learning there is always treat people right. Pay people their fair wages, even the people that work for you. That's part of the ethics of handling money. And then in this past week, Tafazo, let me ask you my last question. You know of Microsoft, obviously. I think in the past few months, we've spoken about Microsoft. They are the most valuable company in the world. Um, have you ever heard of a company called NVIDIA? NVIDIA.
Just in passing, but not in detail.
I'm putting you on the spot deliberately, Tafatsa. It's just part of the things that we do with Tafatsa. I also didn't know them, Tafatsa. So don't feel bad. I also had never heard about this company called Nvidia. Never heard of them. But the reason why I'm mentioning them is that in this past week that we have just concluded, Nvidia became the most valuable or the most expensive company in the world. Before that, Microsoft was the most valuable company. Before Microsoft, Apple was the most valuable company. So some of the valuable companies that we have in the world are companies such as Google, Microsoft, and Apple. Those are the valuable companies that we have. But then there is this company that came from Norway in the past week to become the most valuable company in the whole world. Now, when you look at it, it doesn't surprise you why they became the most valuable company. It's because they are primarily involved in the manufacture of the chips that are used for artificial intelligence technology. So think of Chat GPT. For Chat GPT, for that technology, that artificial intelligence technology to operate, you need certain chips. And so they are the company that manufactures those particular chips. I think I was looking at their stocks just a few minutes ago, a few hours ago. They are no longer the most valuable company in the world. But at some point this week, they became the most valuable company in the world. Two things that I would want to mention, which are relevant to all of us. Sometimes making financial progress in your investment portfolio, and we've said this time and time again, has to do with you doing your research and investing with companies that are going to do amazing things for the future. We've always highlighted artificial intelligence, the green revolutions as some of the trends that are shaping what will happen in the world. So some people have made a lot of money, lots of money in investing in this NVIDIA company. Because if I knew about them and I was doing my research on companies to invest in them, anybody doing interesting things on the artificial intelligence front, particularly if they are successful, their stock price would go up at some point. So that's the first thing that I would want to say. Always align your investment portfolio with companies that are going to do amazing things for the future. Point number two, now that I have told you about NVIDIA, some of you are going to go and look for the stock and try to invest in that company. It's too late. It's really, really too late. The thing about investing is that you buy low and you sell high. So if the stock price is high already, there is not much value that you're going to see in the future. So if you're still interested in a stock like Nvidia, wait for it to go down. And then if they are promising to do amazing things in the future, then you go for it once it's gone down. You do not want to buy when the stock price is high because you're not going to make a lot of money. Let me stop there, Tafazo, so that we can go into what we need to talk about today.
Thank you for that insight. Yes, I've also realized that whenever people talk about a stock that's lucrative, normally the price is not reachable. So I'm sure I'll not make an effort to look at NVIDIA. On the prescriptive, debt prescriptive law, is it the same issue like what the traffic fines here in South Africa, where if one doesn't pay traffic fines for, I think, 5 years, they write it off? Is it like the
So
same
all debt
principle?
prescribes after 3 years. All debt prescribes after 3 years, whether it's debt arising from what a financial institution has given you or it arises out of municipal debt. So there are conditions for prescription, Tafazo. We're not saying after 3 years and you haven't, after 3 years of you getting my, then the debt prescribes. Debt prescribes on condition number one, that during those 3 years you have not acknowledged to whoever you have borrowed money from that you owe the money. In other words, you do not acknowledge. In other words, they suddenly go quiet. Secondly, you yourself have not made an attempt to pay this debt within those 3 years. So if you have made an attempt to contact them and to pay, then you are effectively acknowledge that you owe that money. But debt prescribes after 3 years generally, and that's the law of prescription on those two conditions, Tafazo.
Thank you for that clarification, because I think it was going to give like false hope, I guess, when people think as long as you don't pay for a certain period of time, then you write off the debt. But
Yeah.
today
So
we
what
are
it also
continuing.
means, if somebody owes you money, make an effort to track them so that otherwise if they do not acknowledge the debt or they don't make an attempt to pay, that's why you will hear some creditors say just pay a little amount, or do you acknowledge that you know about this debt? Once you say yes, then the debt continues. You have interrupted the prescription. So if somebody owes you money, do something within those 3 years to interrupt the prescription. That's essentially what we say.
Okay, no, at least was there someone who is owing me now. I was getting a bit concerned, but I have been following up, so so there is hope for payment. Okay, today we are continuing on the topic of trust that we started last week. Themba, would you start recapping on the key points that we covered last week?
So last week we defined what a trust is. We spoke about the advantages and the disadvantages of trust. We spoke a little bit about how trust can be used within the context of estate planning. But under the definition of what a trust is, we basically said a trust is a legal arrangement whereby control over property is transferred to a person or an organization. And so you transfer ownership to a person, and we called that person a trustee. So you, as the founder of the trust, you transfer control to another person or another organization, the trustee. And you do so for the benefit of someone else, and that someone else is the beneficiary. So the trustee then would control the trust assets, and the beneficiary would acquire, the full vested ownership, obviously in accordance with the provisions of the trust deed. So the document that gives rise to a trust is the trust deed. For you to set up a trust, you must just make sure that the objective is not illegal. So you cannot set up a trust for illegal purposes, which some people have done. Then that whole trust is illegal. Generally, in terms of trust law, trusts are not people. You know, a company is a person, it's a legal person, you are a natural person. A trust is not a person, it doesn't have a legal character. Although, as we shall see, for the purpose of taxation, a trust is therefore, just for the purposes of taxation, regarded as a person for the purposes of paying tax. But in essence, a trust comes as a result of a trust deed, but it doesn't have a legal personality. You can terminate a trust, by written agreement on a date that has been set, out by the founder, or if the trust has achieved its objective. And one of the reasons why we're talking about trust, I will talk about the advantages of trust later on, is just to make all of us aware of the advantages and also make all of us aware that it's even possible to register your business in a business trust called a trading trust. I know of people who conduct business in the form of a trading trust. So this is information that we're just giving to people so that you know what your options are. So instead of registering your company with the company registry, you can actually just conduct this business in the form of a trust. Obviously, it's on condition that your main objective is conducting business and that the trustee will manage the assets of the trust for a profit. One of the things that we mentioned last week is that in South Africa, there are generally two types of trusts. Let's just call the one type of trust as a living trust. We called it an inter vivos trust. And then, that's a trust that is created between living persons. Then the other trust is a testamentary trust, which is basically derived from the valid will of a deceased person. I remember particularly, Chafadzo, I remember you asking a question, are trusts only for the wealthy? In other words, are trusts only for wealthy people? I think we did clarify that question. While trusts are commonly associated with wealthier individuals, they can be useful to anybody. Um, Obviously, if the circumstances warrant for the creation of a trust. We just need to be aware that in creating a trust, I think we highlighted that number one, you must seek legal advice. Very, very important to seek a legal advice. We made it clear last week, Tafadzwa, that our advice is that you must involve somebody who is knowledgeable on trust law, knowledgeable on tax law in the creation of a trust. Because I have come across people who create trusts and then within a few years they reverse the decision because they can't keep up with the cost of maintaining a trust. So the point is, trusts are not for wealthy individuals only. You just need to make sure that at the point that you are creating a trust, you've got a sufficient asset base that warrants the incurrence of the costs associated with the trust. But in my view, if the circumstances warrant for you to create a trust, it may be advantageous for you to do that. We spoke about estate planning, and the point that we were making there, Tafadzwa, is that once you accumulate wealth, or even for everyone, one of the things that you must do is to plan your estate. And trusts could be very, very useful in estate planning. In other words, a trust can protect your family wealth. It can preserve your legacy for future generation. By the way, from the discussion that I'm having with you, I think you can begin to see that trust can be created for various purposes. We have had people who have created trusts for charitable purposes. So it's called a charitable trust. We've had people who create what is called a special trust. Maybe a special trust would have the objective of taking care of a disabled child, for example. We also spoke about a business trust. So trusts are created for, for various purposes. But one of the reasons why we must consider the creation of a trust is preserving your legacy for future generation. And that's particularly beneficial in the event of a liquidation, in the event of a lawsuit. Anything can happen if you are in business, and sometimes you need to protect your legacy. You can be sequestrated as an individual because you have accumulated so many debts. Once you have transferred assets to a trust, those assets are protected. You can also divorce. So sometimes one of the areas of conflict in a divorce is the distribution of assets of the couple. Some people have used trusts to protect certain assets from divorce. So those assets that are part of a trust will not be subject to the divorce proceeding. A trust may also be set up to provide for your dependents or your relatives, affording them financial security. So those are all the things that you would need to take into consideration. Last week, Tafadzo, you started off with a verse from the Bible, which basically says, "A good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children." So you can also create a trust as a viable vehicle to benefit your grandchildren or your great grandchildren as the eventual beneficiaries of a trust. So one of the things that we mentioned last week is that to give effect to that biblical scripture, the vehicle that you can use to be able to do that is a trust. So we have seen people who set up a trust for the benefit of minor children. Um, Sometimes those children won't be able to manage their inheritance. So you create a trust for that. We spoke about a number of advantages of setting up a trust, Tafadzo. I will not mention all the advantages now, but some of the advantages have to do with privacy. So if you want privacy as far as your financial affairs are concerned, you do it in the form of a trust. So there are people who would want their affairs to be private. So what normally happens with deceased estates is that deceased estates by law must be advertised in a government gazette. And that applies to wills as well. A will can be, made as a public document so that anyone who may have a claim against you can come forward and have that claim settled upon your death. So if you want privacy, that's a way of doing that. Another advantage that we spoke about is minimizing your taxes, particularly your estate duties. Um, Obviously, you're not going to set up a trust solely for the purposes of minimizing your taxes. I think you need to have other objectives apart from just minimizing your tax objective. Because as I will explain later on, compared to individuals, trusts are taxed at a higher tax rate. So in South Africa, trusts are taxed at 45%. Um, but what we are talking about here is that once assets have been donated to a trust, they cannot be subject to estate duties, for example, and therefore you are able to ensure continuity. You can also use trust as, another advantage of using trust that we spoke about last week is for the purposes of estate planning. So if you want to distribute your possessions effectively, trusts are considered as ideal vehicle to do that so that you can prevent mismanagement of your inheritance. So you've got trustees that you trust who will administer control over those assets and protect the assets and ensure that the assets are used for the benefit of your beneficiaries. So at the end of the day, trusts ensure continuity of assets. I think that's one of the things that we mentioned last week. We went on to talk about disadvantages of trusts. So one disadvantage is that once you put assets in a trust, you do not have ownership over those assets. So there is loss of ownership. Although a founder can also be a trustee. So you can be a trustee. I think we mentioned this last week. Not the only trustee though, but you can be a trustee. The other disadvantage that we spoke about relates to costs of setting up a trust. I think I mentioned a figure north of 12,000 rands, just to give an indication of the type of costs that you can be incurred. And you asked me a question last week, Tafadzwa, where are the costs coming from in setting up a trust? So, and the obvious area where the costs come from is number one, auditing the accounts of a trust, because by law in South Africa, trusts must be audited, but also in paying the advisors for administration of a trust. There could also be a tax disadvantage of a trust, because I mentioned that in South Africa, the top income tax rate applies for a trust. So trusts are taxed at 45% in South Africa. And capital gains sometimes may be applicable for trust. So those are some of the disadvantages. But for those of you who are listening, there are pros and there are cons for creating a trust. That's why you need advice. But this is a very, very useful estate planning, tax planning, asset protection vehicle that you need to be aware of. Obviously, as you set up a trust, there are things that you must always be aware of. You need to be very specific about naming who the beneficiaries are. There have been cases where people are vague in naming who the beneficiaries are, and this has given rise to legal disputes. I'm sure I've also been advising people, particularly the beneficiaries, who are disputing over, who they have got a conflict over the assets that were left in a trust. Although I don't understand how siblings would be at each other's throat, there should be a way of resolving some of these issues. But if whoever has set up the trust is quite specific about naming the beneficiary, sometimes it limits the legal disputes that may that may arise there. One of the biggest difficulties in setting up a trust is selecting who the trustees would be. The trustee is somebody who obviously has to act in your best interest for the benefit of the beneficiaries. So it's an onerous position. So a trustee has to be somebody who is up to the challenge and who is willing to do it. So my preference is to involve professional trustees rather than just involving somebody because you just trust them. Because sometimes it could involve quite some administration. There's administration that is involved there. That's a significant decision. Generally, you'd want to make a trustee somebody that you trust, who will act in your best interest, somebody who is very knowledgeable about what we're talking about. So that was just a recap, Tafadzo, of what we spoke about last week.
Thank you for reminding us and for the recap. Tendai is asking, can you change a beneficiary if a situation changes, and do you pay for that?
So obviously you pay as and when I advise that you involve lawyers in setting up a trust, you involve professional people, but yes, that can be changed as well. So the answer is yes.
Okay. We spoke briefly about tax treatment of trusts. Can you elaborate on this?
So here, again, the purpose of this response is not necessarily to give tax advice. So that's not the purpose. But the purpose is just to highlight that we must be very careful in setting up trusts, and we must receive, advice from people who are knowledgeable. Trusts are accountable for tax. In South Africa, just to illustrate, companies pay a tax rate of 27% in South Africa, but trusts have to pay a tax at 45%. So generally, the income tax rate for trusts is much, much higher than for companies. In fact, that's sort of the highest income tax rate. And compared to individuals, your trust does not qualify for any of the rebates that are mentioned in our Income Tax Act. So one has to be very, very careful, so that you don't end up paying unnecessary taxes, as a result of trust. The points that I would want to highlight: number one, income that has been generated by a trust generally is levied at 45%, which is the highest tax rate. The second bullet point that I would want to mention is that trustees may allocate income and capital to multiple beneficiaries. So that sometimes you can have a situation where the income is vested to the beneficiaries. So it's not in all cases that income will be taxed in the hands of the trust. In some cases, because depending on the circumstances, depending on how the income has been distributed, whether that income depending on how it's been distributed, you can have situations where the income is taxed in the hands of the founder themselves, in the hands of the beneficiaries, or in the hands of the trustees. So it's not in all cases where the income will be taxed in the hands of the trust. It just depends on how the income has been distributed. I spoke about special trusts. A special trust is a trust that is set for a specific purpose, like taking care of a disabled child. So we need to distinguish between a normal trust and a special trust. Special trusts are taxed at a sliding rate, just in the same way as individuals will be taxed. So in South Africa, individuals are taxed on a sliding scale of 18 to 45%. So that would be applicable for special trusts. And some special trusts also can have certain exemptions from capital gains tax. So that's with regard to income tax. Let's talk about capital gains tax. Just to remind our listeners and our viewers, capital gains tax is what is paid with respect to tangible assets, and also for investments. You pay capital gains tax, and it's calculated as the difference between the proceeds that you get for the sale of the asset and what the Income Tax Act refers to as the base cost. All right, so that base cost, could be the original amount that you purchased the asset for. So generally, trusts are taxed at 45% of 80% of the capital gain. If you were to compare that with an individual or with special trusts, they would be taxed at their marginal tax rate, but on only 40% of the capital gain. And the point there that I'm highlighting, there are two bullet points. Point number one, trusts indeed are subject to capital gains tax. Point number two, even with regard to capital gains tax, trusts are taxed at a higher tax rate. We spoke about estate duty. Once assets have been donated to a trust, there is no estate duty that is payable. there. But you could have situations, especially if the founder is setting up a trust, a testamentary trust, you could have a situation where the trust assets are subject to, estate duty. So it's something that would need to be considered before the trust is set up. So that's with regard to estate duty. Then they could also be donations tax, donations tax. In South Africa, donations tax is paid at a rate of 20%. So if you transfer assets into a trust, in other words, you are a donor, donations tax may be applicable there. So it's very important that you consult a tax professional on the implications of donating donating an asset to a trust. You do not want to trigger donations tax, but there are ways of doing that. I know of people that have loaned money to a trust, for example, as part of minimizing taxes. But the purpose of this is not to give tax advice. It's just to be aware of how tax would be applicable. And then the last category of tax that I may want to talk about is VAT, value added tax. So in certain instances, trusts may be required to register for VAT, for value added tax, particularly if the trust is engaged in commercial activities. Remember earlier on we spoke about business trusts. So VAT may be applicable. And currently, VAT is levied at the rate of 15% in South Africa. There are other considerations as well. So I've spoken about tax considerations, but one of the things that has happened with regard to trust is that some people have used trust to disguise ownership, the beneficiary ownership, but also to be involved in money laundering transactions. So trusts have to adhere to certain additional disclosures. And this, we are talking about anti-money laundering requirements related to beneficial ownership. And trusts are required to submit returns to the tax authorities regarding the distributions that have been made to various beneficiaries. So I think that's all that I would want to say at an elementary level, at a basic level, with regard to trust, Fadzu.
Thank you very much. How does one go about registering a trust? And is there any other information you may wish to add on trust?
So we've spoken about different types of trust. To me, when you decide to register a trust, it's crucial to determine the type of trust that basically suits your needs. There are different types of trusts, so it's very, very important to be able to choose the right type of trust. I've come across situations where people are not advised properly, and so they go with a particular type of trust only to change it at some stage. And when you change and you try to undo what you have tried to do, which is the question that Tendai asked about changing beneficiaries and so on, that involves costs. So once you try to undo what you did originally, that may involve costs. So before we even talk about registering trusts, let's just be clear that before you embark on that process of registration, you need to determine the type of trust that best suits your needs. Now that you have done that, let's just reduce it to steps. In fact, because sometimes people want, step one, step two, step three, So when you are setting up a trust, um, remember what I said there, one of the crucial decisions is choosing a trustee. So let's just say step number one, choose a trustee. That's a very critical decision. right? Because a trustee is the person that is responsible for managing the assets and ensuring that it meets, its objective. So whilst you can be a trustee, my advice is that you appoint at least one other independent trustee to ensure impartiality. Um, so in terms of the law, the trustee must be a natural person. So step number one, choose a trustee. Step number two, choose a name for your trustee, for your trust, right? That could also be an important, aspect. I actually like a name that reflects the purpose of the trust. It shouldn't be misleading. It shouldn't be um, um, obviously offensive. Um, uh, Try not to have people associate the trust with yourselves. Just try to choose a unique name which complies with legal requirements. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So choose a trustee, choose a trust name. Then step number three, draft the trust deed. Right, the trust deed is the legal document which basically sets out the terms and conditions of the trust. It would go into detail on things such as the powers and the responsibilities of the trustees, the rights and the entitlements of the beneficiaries, the purpose and the objectives of the trust. Drafting that trust deed can be a very complex, process. That's why my advice is always seek professional assistance, either from a lawyer or from somebody who is a specialist in this area. So once you have drafted that trust deed, you can then go to the next step. So um, we've said step number one, choose a trustee. Step number two, choose the name of the trust. Step number three, draft a trust deed. Step number four, appoint your beneficiaries. Right. So you need to consider the needs and the circumstances of your beneficiary. Write the trust deed in a way that it is flexible to accommodate changes in circumstances, and that the trust deed allows for addition and removal of beneficiaries is necessary. Right. So that's very, very important. So going back to Tendai's question, um, uh, it's very important that at the time of drafting the trust deed, that we do so in a way that is flexible to allow for addition or removal of beneficiaries, so that it's something that can be overseen by the trustees. So now that you have determined your beneficiary, step number five, you then register the trust. Trusts are registered with the master of the High Court. So unlike companies, companies are registered with the company registry. In South Africa, that would be the CIPC, the company, that's the company registry, here. But the master of the High Court is the official responsible for overseeing the administration of the trust. And it's a question of going to the Department of Justice website. You will actually see that there are documents that need to be completed there. You would need to submit your trust deed. You would need to complete an application form, and other documents as well. If I remember very well, apart from the application form, you would need to have an acceptance of trusteeship, completed, an acceptance of auditor application. Remember what I said? You need documents such as the beneficiary declaration, things such as certified copies of the trustees. Obviously, trustees cannot act as trustees until they receive confirmation from the master of the High Court. So that was step number five. Then step number six, you then open a bank account for the trust. Opening a bank account, it's essential. It's an essential step in managing the financial affairs. Then step number seven, you then transfer the assets to the trust. And then step number eight, you then maintain and manage the trust. So once the trust has been registered, the assets have been transferred, the bank account has been opened, it's then important to maintain and manage the trust, effectively. Trusts have to keep accurate records of the financial transactions. So again, our advice is, seek professional, assistance in managing the affairs of the trust. So that's all I wanted to say, Tafazo, about registering a trust and administering a trust. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Themba, for that comprehensive information. I think with our time, we've come to the end of the show. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I saw a sister joining us from Abu Dhabi. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. If you want to get in touch with Themba, you can connect with him on his LinkedIn account, and his name is Themba Mazibuko. You can also follow him on his YouTube account, Managing Your Finances Like a Black Belt. And you can write us an email to tafazwa@tafazwamazibukospeaks.co.za. You can also check out our website, www.tafazwamazibukospeaks.co.za. And I also got a YouTube account that is worth fighting for. Again, we appreciate. Let's continue developing ourselves financially and developing our financial education so that we are better. We have financial intelligence. Let's grow together. Your dream is worth fighting for. Enjoy the rest of the weekend. Cheers.